Hey everyone, welcome back. It's your host here. I wanted to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. In this video, we're going to explore what actually lurked in the depths beneath Moria when Gandalf fell with the Balrog. Most people focus on the Balrog itself, but there was something far older and more terrifying waiting in those abysses. Gandalf himself mentioned creatures so ancient they have no names, things that have been gnawing at the very foundations of the world since before Sauron even existed. Let's dive in. Hey there, fellow travelers of Middle. When Gandalf and the Balrog plummeted from the bridge of Khazad-dûm, they fell for what seemed like an eternity. Gandalf describes this fall in the Two Towers, and if you read it carefully, you realize they didn't just drop into some underground lake or cavern, they fell through the mountain itself, through chambers the dwarves had carved, past the endless stair, down into regions where no pick or hammer had ever struck. The fall was long enough that Gandalf lost all sense of time and direction. Fire and water clashed around them as they descended, the Balrog's flames hissing against underground streams, creating steam and chaos in the darkness. For a Maya, this kind of descent represents something more profound than simple geography. They were going down into the bones of the world itself. Now, in the Two Towers, when Gandalf recounts his battle to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, he says something that always struck me as odd. He mentions that far, far below the deepest delving of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Not monsters with names and histories. Not creatures spawned by Morgoth or Sauron. Nameless things. Tolkien chose that word very deliberately. These beings don't have names because they predate language itself. They were there before the elves awoke and gave names to everything they saw, before the dwarves carved their first hall, before even Morgoth descended into Arda and began his corruption. These entities represent something from the earliest days of creation, perhaps from the discord in the music of the Aenir itself. In the Silmarillion, we learn how the world was created through song, how the Aenir sang the world into being under Elvitar's direction. But Melkor, who would become Morgoth, introduced discord into that music. He wanted to create things of his own, to have power equal to Ilvatar's. That discord didn't just disappear when the world was made real. It became part of the fabric of Arda itself, woven into the foundations. The deepest places of the world, the regions far below mountains and seas, these would be where that original discord settled and festered. It's entirely possible that the nameless things Gandalf encountered are manifestations of that primordial chaos. Beings that were never meant to exist in the ordered world, but came into being anyway through the cracks in creation. Think about what this means for Gandalf's experience. He's a Maya, yes, but he came to Middle-earth in a limited form, in the body of an old man, with restrictions placed upon him by the Valar. He was sent to guide and counsel, not to match power with power against the great evils of the world. But down there in the deep, he wasn't just fighting the Balrog. He was in proximity to things that perhaps even the Valar would hesitate to confront directly. These nameless things, according to Gandalf's own words, have been gnawing at the earth since before recorded history. They're patient, they're hungry, and they exist in a state that might not even be fully physical in the way we understand it. What did Gandalf actually see down there? He doesn't give us details, and that's probably intentional on Tolkien's part. Some horrors are more effective when left to imagination, but we can piece together clues. Gandalf mentions gnawing, which suggests these things consume the very substance of the earth. They're breaking down the world at its foundations, slowly, inexorably. This isn't malice in the way Sauron practices malice. This is something more fundamental, more alien. These beings might not even be aware of the world above them in any meaningful sense. Simply exist and consume, following patterns set down at the moment of creation, or perhaps in that discord before creation properly began. The courage it must have taken for Gandalf to continue his pursuit of the Balrog in those depths is staggering when you think about it this way. He could have let the creature go, could have tried to find his way back up through the mountain, but he knew that Balrog represented a clear and present danger to the Fellowship's mission. To all of Middle-earth? Really? So he followed it down into places where even his spirit was at risk. Not just at risk of death, because Maiar don't die in the way mortals do, but at risk of something worse. Perhaps dissolution or corruption, or being lost in those primordial depths forever. He fought the Balrog for 10 days, from the lowest dungeon to the highest peak. And during those 10 days in the deep, he was surrounded by things that scared him. It's worth sitting with for a moment. things that scared Gandalf the Grey. There's a reason Tolkien had Gandalf mention these nameless things only briefly. It adds a layer of cosmic horror to Middle-earth that most readers might miss on first pass. We're used to thinking of the dangers in Lord of the Rings as orcs, trolls, Nazgul, Sauron himself. Clear enemies with clear motivations. But beneath all of that, beneath the mountains and the earth, there are older things stirring. Things that make even the Balrog seem like a known quantity. When Gandalf came back as Gandalf the White, he had been to the edge of existence and returned. He had seen what lurks in the spaces between the world's foundations. And that experience changed him in ways that go beyond just the power upgrade from gray to white. The depths beneath Moria connect to something Tolkien explored more in the Silmarillion. It's the idea that evil in Middle-earth has layers. You've got your immediate threats like Sauron and Saruman, and you've got older evils like the Balrogs, servants of Morgoth from the First Age. But beneath even that, there's something more primal. Morgoth himself in the First Age didn't create evil from nothing. He took what was already there in the discord of the music and shaped it, amplified it, gave it form and purpose. But the raw material he worked with, that chaos and disharmony that predates even him, it's been there since before the beginning, and in the deepest places of the world, it never fully went away. When the dwarves delved too greedily and too deep in Moria, they weren't just mining for Mithril. They were breaking through layers of reality that had been sealed since the world's formation. The Mithril itself is interesting in this context. It's described as stronger than steel, but light as a feather found only in Moria, glowing with its own inner light. What if Mithril formed in these deep places precisely because of the strange conditions there, where the normal rules of matter and creation are bent by proximity to those primordial forces? The dwarves were literally digging at the boundary between the ordered world and the chaos beneath it. They found incredible wealth, yes, but they also found something they couldn't control. Durin's folk had lived in Khazad-dûm for thousands of years before they woke the Balrog. The Balrog itself had been sleeping there since the end of the First Age, since the War of Wrath, when Morgoth was defeated and his servants fled or hid. That's over 5,000 years of slumber in the deep dark. What was it doing during all that time? Was it truly sleeping, or was it aware on some level of what surrounded it in those depths? The Balrog is a corrupted mire, a being of fire and shadow, powerful and terrible. But even it chose to hide in the deepest, darkest place it could find. Maybe it wasn't just hiding from the forces of the West. Maybe it was also seeking refuge from the nameless things, finding a layer of depth where it could exist without being gnawed at by whatever dwells even further down. The passage in the Two Towers where Gandalf describes his battle is brief, but packed with implications. He says they fought in tunnels where no living thing had walked, where the very rock was different from anything carved by dwarf or shaped by natural force. These weren't caverns worn smooth by water over ages. These were spaces that existed in the gaps, almost like geological impossibilities that somehow remained. Gandalf mentions that the air itself was strange, that time seemed to flow differently. For 10 days he pursued the Balrog upward from those depths, fighting it through tunnels and chambers, until finally they reached the peak of Zerek-Zigil, where the sun could touch them again. But here's what gets me. In those 10 days, Gandalf was utterly alone except for the enemy he fought. No fellowship, no companions, no light except his own power and the Balrog's flames. Just darkness, stone, and the knowledge that beneath him, even as he climbed, things far older than his mission gnawed at existence itself. He couldn't allow himself to think about it too much, or fear would have paralyzed him. He had to focus on the immediate threat, the Balrog, while being aware that he was fighting in a place where the very concepts of good and evil became murky and strange. The Balrog was evil, yes, corrupted by Morgoth's will, but the things in the deep weren't evil in that sense. They were something else entirely, something that existed outside the moral framework that defined the struggles of Middle-earth. There's a letter Tolkien wrote where he discussed the nature of evil in his world. He talked about how Morgoth couldn't create life, only corrupt what Iluvatar had made. But he also hinted at things that existed in the margins, beings or forces that were part of the world's growing pains, so to speak. When Arda was formed from the music, it wasn't a clean process. There were contradictions, discords, places where the song didn't quite resolve into harmony. Those places would have physical manifestations in the geography and geology of the world. The deepest abysses, the roots of mountains, the spaces between tectonic foundations, these would be where you'd find the remnants of creation's chaos. Gandalf's mention of these nameless things is one of the few times in Tolkien's work where we get a glimpse of cosmic horror in the Lovecraftian sense. Most of Middle-earth's evil is comprehensible. Sauron wants dominion. Saruman wants power. Orcs want to destroy and consume. Even Morgoth's evil, vast as it was, had motivations we can understand. Jealousy and pride and the desire to dominate, but nameless things that gnaw the earth. That's different. That's incomprehensible. They don't want anything. Simply are. And their existence is antithetical to the ordered world above them. They represent entropy, perhaps, or the universe's tendency toward chaos, asserting itself against the music's imposed order. The Balrog, by comparison, is almost comforting. It's a known evil. It serves Morgoth's agenda, even though Morgoth is long gone, cast into the void. It has fire and darkness. It carries a whip and a blade of flame, can be fought, and as Gandalf proved, it can be defeated. But how do you defeat something that doesn't even have a name? How do you fight something that exists in a state between being and non-being, gnawing at reality from the inside? You don't. You can only avoid it. Stay away from the depths where it dwells, and hope that the world's foundations are strong enough to contain it. This adds a whole new dimension to the tragedy of Moria. The dwarves didn't just lose their greatest kingdom to a Balrog. They lost it because they delved into places that should have remained sealed. Their mining, their insatiable hunger for mithril and wealth, led them to break through barriers that protected the surface world from what lay beneath. Once those barriers were breached, there was no going back. The Balrog emerged, yes, but the passages were open now. Who knows what else might have started to seep upward through those tunnels? The dwarves fled, and Moria stood empty for over 1,000 years before the Fellowship dared to enter. In all that time, anything could have crept up from below. The Watcher in the water at Moria's western gate might be connected to this. Gandalf seems uncertain about what it is, which is unusual for him. He says it's been lying in the dark, growing, and that the waters of the Saranen have become foul and stagnant because of it. The creature has tentacles, many of them, and it's strong enough to nearly drag Frodo into the depths. It also seems to specifically target the Ringbearer, suggesting some level of awareness or connection to Sauron's will. But Gandalf doesn't identify it as one of Sauron's creatures. He doesn't know what it is, and that ignorance is telling. Could it be something that came up from the depths after the dwarves broke through? Could it be related to these nameless things or spawned by them? In Tolkien's broader mythology, there's precedent for ancient water-dwelling horrors. Ungoliant, the great spider who nearly devoured Morgoth himself, came from the darkness beyond the world. She wasn't one of Morgoth's creations. She was something else, something that found her way into Arda and allied with Morgoth only as long as it served her hunger. After she turned on Morgoth and he barely escaped, she fled into forgotten lands and was never seen again. Some of Tolkien's notes suggest she went south and east into regions unmapped, but it's entirely possible that creatures like her found their way into the deep, places of the earth where they could exist unseen and slowly spawn their own kind. The Watcher's tentacles, its preference for darkness, its apparent immortality. These all suggest something very old and very alien to the normal fauna of Middle-earth. If it's connected to the things beneath Moria, it might be a lesser manifestation of that primordial chaos, something that can exist in water, in darkness, but hasn't fully emerged into the light of the ordered world. Gandalf's uncertainty about it, his sense that it's been growing and changing in the dark, suggests that these deep earth creatures aren't static. They evolve, adapt, and possibly spawn in ways that don't follow natural biological rule. When the Fellowship passes through Moria, they feel the weight of the darkness. Gimli expects to find his cousin Balin's colony alive and thriving, but instead they find death and destruction. The orcs have moved in, yes, but there's something else in the air, a sense of wrongness that goes beyond just enemy occupation. Gandalf is tense from the moment they enter, constantly listening, constantly wary. He knows what's down here, not just the Balrog, but the implication of what lies beneath even that. Every step they take is a step over an abyss they can't see. Foundations that have been compromised by the dwarves' mining and the subsequent eruption of ancient evils. The Chamber of Mazarbul, where they find Balin's tomb, tells a story of desperate last stands and overwhelming darkness. The record book describes attacks from orcs, yes, but also mentions drums in the deep, a sound that terrifies the dwarves of Balin's colony before the end. Drums in the deep.
Oh, what makes that sound?
Orcs can make noise, but there's something about the phrasing that suggests something older, something communicating through rhythm and vibration in the stone itself. Could the nameless things, in their gnawing and movement through the earth's roots, create sounds that echo up through the rock? Could the dwarves have heard not just their immediate enemies, but the movement of things far below, things disturbed by all the commotion of battle and death? When the Balrog appears, it comes with a sense of ancient power that silences even the orcs. They flee from it, terrified. The Balrog is their superior in Morgoth's hierarchy, but more than that, it represents something from an age before their time. The orcs are relatively recent creations, corrupted elves or men, depending on which version of Tolkien's notes you follow. But the Balrog is from the First Age, from the time when Morgoth himself walked Middle-earth in physical form and waged war against the Valar. Its very presence is a reminder that the history of evil in this world is long and deep, and that the current age's troubles are just the latest chapter in a much older story. Gandalf faces the Balrog on the bridge because he knows someone has to. He is the only one in the Fellowship with the power to even attempt a confrontation with such a being. The other Istari might have been able to do it. Saruman certainly had the raw power, but Saruman had fallen to corruption. Radagast had long since abandoned the affairs of men and elves for the concerns of beasts and birds. Like Gandalf stood there in that moment, staff in one hand, sword glamdring in the other, facing down a creature that had terrorized the greatest elven kingdoms of the First Age, and he knew that if he fell with it into the abyss, he'd be descending into regions that scared even him. The phrase, "Fly, you fools," has been analyzed endlessly by fans and scholars. But in this context, it takes on additional meaning. Gandalf isn't just telling them to run from the Balrog. He's telling them to get out of Moria entirely, to escape while they can, because if he fails and the Balrog survives, the Fellowship has no hope against it. But also, perhaps he's telling them to flee because he knows what's down in those depths, and he doesn't want them anywhere near this place if things go wrong. He's about to descend into the primordial darkness, and whatever happens there, he wants them far away in the sunlight, where the evil is at least comprehensible. The fight on the bridge is brief but crucial. Gandalf's power breaks the bridge, the stone cracks and falls away, and the Balrog goes down into the gulf. But its whip lashes out, catches Gandalf's ankle, and drags him over the edge. In that moment, Gandalf makes a choice. Could try to save himself, could use his power to break free or teleport, or any number of things that Maya might be capable of, but he doesn't. He holds on and then lets go, accepting the fall, because he knows that if he doesn't pursue this Balrog into the deep and finish it, it will just return. It will hunt the Fellowship, or it will emerge later to threaten other lands. So he falls into darkness and uncertainty, trusting that his mission and his power will be enough to see him through whatever waits below. The fall itself must have been horrifying, not the physical sensation, though that would be bad enough, but the spiritual weight of descending into those depths. Gandalf would have felt the presence of the nameless things, sensed them in the stone and water around him, known that he was entering their domain. His light, the inner light of his Maya spirit, would have been the only thing holding back that primordial darkness. And the Balrog, creature of fire and shadow, would have been doing the same in its own way. Its flames a declaration of power and existence against the gnawing void. They fell into water, a deep underground lake that had never seen sun or moon. The water was cold, Gandalf says, colder than anything he'd experienced in Middle-earth. Cold that seeps into the spirit, not just the body. The Balrog's fire hissed and steamed in that water, but it didn't go out. They fought in the lake in the darkness, light and fire against the weight of stone and water and the presence of things even older than themselves. How long they fought there, Gandalf doesn't say. Time had no meaning in those depths. It could have been hours or days. The water would have carried sounds, strangely echoing their battle through caverns and tunnels that extended in all directions into unmapped eternity. Eventually, Gandalf pursued the Balrog out of the water and into the tunnels beyond. These were spaces the dwarves had never reached, passages that existed in the natural structure of the mountain, or perhaps in the unnatural structure. Spaces created by the gnawing of those nameless things over countless ages. The rock here was strange, Gandalf says. Not the familiar stone of Upper Moria, at granite or basalt or any named mineral, but something else rock that had been exposed to forces that changed its fundamental nature, perhaps the pressure of the abyss or the touch of those primordial beings as they consumed the earth around them. In these tunnels, Gandalf and the Balrog fought with blade and flame, with word and spell, with the fundamental powers of their Maya natures. The Balrog was trying to escape, trying to climb back up to levels it knew, but Gandalf wouldn't let it. He harried it, attacked it, drove it upward, but also wore it down, step by step and blow by blow. He used Glamdring, the Foehammer, a sword forged in Gondolin in the First Age, specifically for fighting servants of Morgoth. The blade had history with these creatures, had tasted their blood and shadow before. In Gandalf's hands it sang with purpose. But the Balrog was strong, incredibly strong. It had survived the War of Wrath, had hidden successfully for 5,000 years, had killed countless dwarves when it awoke. It wielded weapons of fire, a sword that burned with heat beyond normal flame, and a whip that could crack stone. Every blow it struck, Gandalf had to counter or dodge. Every spell it cast, Gandalf had to match or deflect. And all around them, in the stone and the darkness, the presence of the nameless things gnawing, always gnawing, patient and eternal. If Gandalf fell here, if the Balrog killed him, his spirit would be released from his body. But where would it go? In the normal world, Amaya's spirit would return to the halls of Mandos in Valinor. But here, in the deep, so far from the light, would his spirit find its way? Or would it be caught, trapped, perhaps consumed by the things that dwelt in this primordial darkness? These are the stakes that Gandalf faced. It's not just physical death, which, as an immortal mire, he'd experienced before in various forms, but the possibility of being truly lost. The mission he'd been sent on by the Valar could fail, not because Sauron defeated him, but because he'd descend so far into the abyss that he couldn't return. The ring would continue toward Mordor without his guidance. The Free Peoples would fight without his counsel, and he would be gone, not dead, but absent, existing in a state of horror in the foundations of the world. So he fought harder, pushed himself beyond what he thought possible because the alternative was unthinkable. Day after day, they climbed. The Balrog sought escape and Gandalf sought victory. They rose through levels of increasing familiarity from the strange deep rock to tunnels that showed signs of dwarvish work, to the great halls and chambers that the dwarves had carved in their glory days. They climbed the endless stair, a passage that went from the deepest dungeons all the way to the peak of the mountain. The stair wound through the heart of Moria, sometimes through open shafts, sometimes through tight corridors, always ascending. It was a marvel of dwarvish engineering, and it became the path of an epic battle between two of the mire. On the endless stair, they had no room for grand spellwork or sweeping attacks. It was blade work, close and desperate. The Balrog's size was a disadvantage in the narrow spaces, but its strength was still overwhelming. Gandalf had to use every trick he knew, every technique he'd learned in his long existence. He fought not as Gandalf the Grey, the wizard who counseled and guided, but as Olorine, the Mire, who had walked in Valinor before the world aged. He reached deep into his power, using reserves he'd been forbidden to tap under normal circumstances, because this was no longer a normal circumstance. This was survival, and more than survival, this was ensuring that the Balrog died and could never threaten the world again. They reached the peak Durin's Tower, on the summit of Xir-Oxagal. Here, finally, they had room to fight openly. The sun was rising, the first natural light Gandalf had seen in 10 days. The Balrog burst into full flame, no longer dampened by water or confined by stone. It became what it truly was, a creature of fire and shadow, wings of darkness spreading wide. Though whether those wings could actually bear it aloft or were just manifestations of its power, Tolkien leaves ambiguous. Gandalf stood before it, staff raised, glandering, shining with reflected firelight, and for a moment they paused. Two ancient beings regarding each other in the dawn, then they fought the final battle. Up here, Gandalf could draw on the light of the sun, the wind of the high peaks, the clean air that had never known the taint of the deep. He cast down the Balrog, struck it with all his remaining power, and the creature fell from the peak, its fire extinguished at last. But the effort cost Gandalf everything. He'd burned through his physical form, pushed it beyond its limits. He died there on the peak, his body giving out, his mission apparently complete. His spirit left the body and began the long journey back to Valinor, to the halls of Mandos, where he would report his failure to the Valar. Because in his mind, even though he'd defeated the Balrog, he'd failed. He'd left the Fellowship without guidance, abandoned his mission, died when he was most needed. But the Valar saw differently. They saw a Maya who had descended into the literal depths of evil, who had faced not just a Balrog, but the primordial chaos at the worlds. Roots who had fought for 10 days without rest or aid, and who had triumphed. They sent him back not as Gandalf the Grey, but as Gandalf the White, with greater power and fewer restrictions. They essentially promoted him, gave him Saruman's former position as head of the Istari Order, and sent him back to Middle-earth to complete his mission. When he returned, he carried with him the memory of the deep, the knowledge of what lurked beneath Moria, the understanding that the evil in Middle-earth had layers that most people never suspected. Gandalf's journey through the depths beneath Moria represents something important in Tolkien's mythology. It shows that even in a world with clear moral lines, with defined good and evil, there are still mysteries and horrors that transcend those categories. The nameless things aren't servants of Sauron or Morgoth. There's something else, something that was there before and will be there after, gnawing at the foundations, patient and timeless. They represent the reality that creation is never fully tamed, that chaos always remains at the edges, that the music of the Anir left discordant notes in the world's structure that can never be fully resolved. For the rest of the story, Gandalf carries this knowledge with him. When he counsels about the danger of Sauron, he does so with the understanding that Sauron, terrible as he is actually a comprehensible evil. Sauron can be fought and defeated. The nameless things cannot. The best course is to stay away from the depths where they dwell. This is why I think Gandalf is so insistent throughout the rest of the trilogy on taking measured, careful steps,